the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
So, Geoff, this might be an appropriate time of the podcast to slightly deviate away from cricket to talk about the association ground, the pre-SCG title of the ground. Talk about how it would become a multi-sporting venue. So, although cricket was the primary sport played there going well back into the 19th century, it had to accommodate other sports to, I think the phrase you used in your book was to pay the bills. During the 1880s and the 1890s, what other sports were played at the association ground, and how did it affect cricket being played there?
The original hope for the Cricket Association was that the ground would be purely a cricket ground. The original deed of grant allowed for other recreations to take place on the ground, provided they did not interfere with cricket. Sheridan and the members of the ground committee discovered very early on that the cost of developing and maintaining a major sporting ground is extreme. It costs a lot of money just cleaning the ground.
Yes.
It's very, very interesting just to maintain a ground. They learnt that very early. That lesson is still being learnt by ground administrators around the world today.
Mhm.
And what they didn't allow football of any code on the ground until 1881. But from 1881, during the winter, they looked to have football and cycling and running, pedestrianism events on the ground, also school carnivals. They hired the ground out to business people for matches. They were looking basically to pay the rent, and this frustrated the cricketers, even though the cricketers had the call on the ground in summer because of the way the deed of grant was structured. But gradually, as sports like uh, especially rugby, football, and cycling became crowd pleasers and drew big crowds, the trustees, or Sheridan and the ground committee working for the trustees, looked for opportunities to stage events in summer. And as cricket became less popular in the late 1880s, it was hard for cricket to say to Sheridan, well, we want to play a game of club cricket there on Saturday, which will draw 3 people, when they could hold a cycling event that might attract 6 or 8 thousand people. So this became an ongoing battle. It became the subject of court cases, a famous court case in 1903-04, as to what the trustees could actually do. But yeah, during the 1880s, lacrosse was played at the ground. There was that baseball series I alluded to earlier
Mhm.
when Spalding's team came to Australia. There were also fireworks displays, which
Oh, wow.
caused some carnage one day when a stall went up in smoke. They staged concerts at the ground, public schools gatherings. After the Amateur Athletics Association was formed in, I think, about 1888, the carnivals were held. And that's how the ground evolved. And then in the 1890s, or basically following the English rugby tour in 1888 and a tour by the Maoris a year later, when rugby became a significant spectator sport, the ground essentially became a rugby ground and in winter and a cricket ground in summer. And then as cycling became hugely popular in the 1890s, it became a cycling ground as well, to the point that some angry cricketers referred to the ground as the Sydney Cycling Ground.
Well, and it is to this day still a multi-sporting venue. I mean, perhaps for my Northern Hemisphere listeners, every second week in winter, of course, it hosts Australian rules football. The Sydney Swans play there and train there, and there are still other events held there. Like recently there was, I think, a concert for Andrea Bocelli, which left some damage on the ground, and then the footballers were tripping over and etc. So it's funny how nothing has really changed in 140 years or so.
No, that's true. And I mean, there was one, I think about 1897, there was about 4 different sports and a carnival to celebrate Queen Victoria's Jubilee,
Mm,
all held in the space of 4 days. Uh, and the thing we have to stress in all of this, it comes back to the fact that Sydney had so few grounds
yes.
that all these events had to take place at the Sydney Cricket Ground because there was nowhere else that could hold such an event. If a cycling carnival was going to draw a big crowd, it had to be at the Association Ground or later the SCG because there was nowhere else. Cycling entrepreneurs tried to build a stadium at Ashfield in Sydney's west, but it went broke very, very quickly. The only alternative was the Agricultural Ground, which opened in 1882, which was run by the Royal Agricultural Society, and it was immediately known later as the Sydney Showground, and it was based immediately south of the SCG.
Get out the way, you better run, brother possum. Get out the way, you better run, brother possum, run.
Well, let's expand on that idea of cycling, because if anyone has seen one of those magnificent panoramic photos of the Sydney Cricket Ground from like the 1890s, there is something very odd which catches your eye, and that is a beige ring around the sporting field, which is not there today, obviously. And for a long time, I didn't know what this was until I started reading about it. And yes, it's a cycling track. And I think there are even newspaper reports of how this affected the cricketers. Often the ball would land on the cricket track, etc., etc. Can you just expand on why it was at the SCG, but also the logistics of having a track there? Like, how long was it there for? Was it permanent? When did they remove it? All that sort of thing.
As I said, cycling grew in popularity enormously in the first half of the 1890s. And in part was that because it became a form of transport.
Mm.
It
Yeah.
was crucially a part of life to have a bike. If you were middle class, could afford a bike. If you were middle class, you could go to the sporting events at the Sydney Cricket Ground. In 1895, the great American cyclist Arthur Zimmerman came to Australia, and he drew a record crowd, I think, of 29,000
Wow.
to to the SCG. It was more than it had been at the for Stoddard's test matches the previous year. It was a huge event in Sydney over 2 Saturdays, and it clearly demonstrated the popularity of cycling.
Mm.
After Zimmerman rode it on the grass track at the SCG, and he rode during the cricket season in November, Zimmerman was then taken to the agricultural ground next door, and he helped advise the people there on how to build a cycling track because the agricultural ground saw cycling as a way of becoming a genuine competitor with the SCG.
Right.
And they then built their track and held a big carnival at the agricultural ground early in 1896. Sheridan saw that and realised that if he wanted his ground, the SCG, to remain the number one ground in Sydney, he needed cycling back. And the only way he could get cycling back was to build a banked asphalt track around the ground. And that is what he did. And the cycling track opened in 1896 and didn't affect the ground too much in the sense that they extended the ground by 3 or 4 metres at the southern and northern end. And the old SCG had a drain around it, and
Mm.
the edge of the boundary was the edge of the drain closest to the field. So by building the cycling track over the drain, it meant they didn't lose too much of the playing field.
Is this why? Sorry to jump in, Jeff.
Yep.
There's, I think, some great photos of around this time. It's either Trumper and Duff, or it might even be McLaren, Stoddart. You see the back of them entering the ground, and they're having to climb up some
That's
steps.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Because the it was a bank cycling track, and the higher end edge of the track, the edge closer to the crowd, was the level of the top of the picket fence.
Mm.
The rule, quite incongruously, was the edge of the cycling track closer to the square was the boundary in terms of hitting a 4, but you could be caught on the cycling track. So a
Yeah.
fieldsman could run up the cycling track and take a catch. So a 5, as it was in those days, had to clear the cycling track,
Right.
uh,
Yes.
such as the incongruous rules that they came up with.
Mm.
It's an interesting thing because it's one of several things, building things that were done at the ground in that time. And this was the time when the ground became recognised as genuinely beautiful. Beautiful was an adjective that was used to describe it often in this period.
Mm.
But at the same time, Fred Spother said of the SCG in 1902, "It is the finest ground in the world, and if they do away with the bicycle track, it will be finer still."
Very appropriate. And when did they do away with the bicycle track?
It didn't survive the war.
Right.
So
Yeah.
cycling was huge in Sydney until the Great War, until the 1914. But then, and it's just a reflection of society, the motor car took over.
Yes.
Motorized bike racing became more popular, and in 1920, with an English rugby league tour coming to Australia that year, and then an Ashes tour at the end of the year, they made the decision to get rid of the cycling track to increase the capacity of the ground. Famously, in 1920, the cycling track had been taken down, but they got 69,000 for a rugby league game there, and they needed the extra space.
Of course.
But the cycling track was a huge success for a while. Lights were put in 1897, and certainly around the period 1903-04, when the great American cyclist Major Taylor came to Sydney, there's no question the cycling was the biggest show in town. Uh,
Mm.
it would have been, I think, an absolutely fantastic night out
Yes.
to
No,
go to the
indeed.
night cycling in Sydney.
Absolutely. And it is one of those peculiarities of its history, but it should be proud of that peculiarity. And so, for anyone listening, next time you see a photo from this period, the golden age of cricket, and you see that ring around the sporting field, that is why it was a cycling track.
What's interesting about Sheridan's decision and the ground committee to build the cycling track is that, as I say, history, we could always learn from history, but there was a repeat of that in 1978 when the trustees decided to build floodlights.
Mm,
The motivation being that they didn't want Kerry Packer to play his World Series cricket elsewhere. So they made the decision to build the floodlights, even though they realised that that would diminish the beauty of the ground.
yes.
And I
And
think we're in a similar, we're approaching a similar position now in the 21st century, where the trustees or the people who run the ground have resisted the idea of a drop in pitch
mhm.
because they would lose the character of the ground. But as you mentioned earlier, the Sydney Swans now play there in the winter, getting 40,000 people every week.
Mhm.
T20 cricket doesn't need a cricket pitch of character, they just need a pitch.
Yeah.
So the arguments against a drop in pitch are becoming harder and harder for the administrators to resist. And if the day comes when there's a possibility that the Swans or T20 cricket would go elsewhere, the cricket ground's going to have to think very, very seriously about a drop in pitch, as they had to think very seriously about floodlights, and as they had to think very seriously about Ashfield bike track in 1896.
Yes, and shows how administrators do need to stay on top of society's demands. It's an interesting discussion, and we're going to return to it perhaps at the end of this podcast when we talk about the future of the Sydney Cricket Ground, which I anticipate you will have some interesting thoughts, Geoff. So, at this point in time, we're talking about the history. Of course, the ground is known as the Association Ground, but it transitions to the Sydney Cricket Ground at some time between October and December of 1893. The exact date, indeed, the exact reason for that is not exactly known. Why do you believe this happened? Was it to align it with the other two test playing grounds, that being the Melbourne Cricket Ground and the Adelaide Oval, or was it more incidental than that?
No, I'm not sure if that was about a specific alignment, though it was a natural move. The first the public knew of it was when SCG flag was flown over the members' pavilion in March 1894. But there are minute entries from late in 1893. Richard Teese, one of the members of the ground committee, was instructed to, when he on a trip to England, to get a trophy inscribed as being a trophy for rugby, as being donated by the trustees of the Sydney Cricket Ground.
Right.
And Sidney Fowler was instructed to order towels for the dressing room in the members' pavilion, with carried the name the Sydney Cricket Ground. These decisions were made before that flag flew in March 1894. So you're absolutely right about we don't know when that specific decision was made. It's not minuted as such. There are several reasons why it could have been made. I think the most important was just Sheridan and the ground committee and the trustees asserting their independence from the New South Wales Cricket Association. Interestingly, there was a state election coming up later in 1894, and it was likely that George Reid would become Premier and Joseph Carruthers would become the Secretary for Lands. And Sheridan and his fellow trustees always had an eye on politics because they realised that, in a sense, the government was their masters because they were trustees for the ground.
Mm.
And they knew that Reid and Carruthers both had strong links with the Cricket Association. Another interesting aspect to it is that electorate cricket was introduced in Sydney in 1893-94, which meant that rather than the local competition being amongst private clubs, it would now be amongst teams representing the local districts. What that meant was that those local district teams would play at their local parks, which was now possible because local parks were finally being built, albeit, say, at Rushcutters Bay and Birchgrove Oval and Wentworth Park were all built on reclaimed land. But that then offered the possibility that in the future that one of these suburban parks might grow into a major operation. And I think that by calling the association ground, changing its name to the Sydney Cricket Ground, that was just about uh, trying to preserve the ground status as the number one ground in Sydney. In a sense, they might have been just taking the name before anyone else could do that. It certainly put the Cricket Association's nose out of joint. They were still complaining about it 20 years later because
Yeah.
because it was done without any consultation, which I think reflects on the strained relationship between the two bodies.
Yes, but it's almost like that. There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. I just feel like the people probably embraced saying SCG rather than Association Ground. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as SCG.
Whenever they start any Bolshevik stuff, I make a motion that we treat them rough. All those in favor say aye. 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 Aye.
Geoff, let's talk about the architecture and the stands which existed at the ground at this point in time. The etymology of the grandstand, which was built in the 1880s, which became known as the Brewongle Stand, is quite confusing, I have to say. How and why was this stand named?
This is one of my favourite stories in the history of the Sydney Cricket Ground. Credit needs to go to the great cricket writer and historian Philip Derryman, who first found out the reason why it was called the Brewongle Stand. For many, many, many years, it was believed to relate back to the local Indigenous people who it was their land, and that was a word from their language, but that is not actually true. What happened was, well, when the grandstand was built in 1881, it was just called the Grandstand, capital G, capital S. That's its name. And then in 1894, or before that, there was a tea room in the bowels of the grandstand, which no one had been able to make work. And in 1894, two sisters who lived at Double Bay applied to become, with little catering experience, applied to take over the tea room, and they got the job. And when they were there at the beginning of the 1894-95 season, decorating their new tea room, they said to Sydney Phelan, the ground secretary, "Could we call the tea room the Brewongle Tea Room?" And he just said, "Yeah, that'll be fine." And the reason for that, the sisters lived with their family in a home at Double Bay in Sydney's eastern suburbs, and the house they lived in was called Brewongle. It was the family home. The families actually had previously lived in the Western Plains near Bathurst, about 11 their property was about 11 kilometres from the village of Brewongle. And so the home at Double Bay was named Brewongle after where they originally came from. They then named their tea room the Brewongle Tea Room. The business was a success. They made it work. I think one of the reasons they made it work is that they were there at the right time. The 1894-95 series was so popular.
Mm.
Football was increasing in popularity as well. Cycling was going really, really well. So there were more opportunities to sell scones and tea and whatever. At some point, a sign is put up on the railing outside of the tea room, up at the front railing of the grandstand. It's a big sign that says Brewongle in big letters, tea room in much smaller letters, and an arrow pointing down to the tea rooms below. I think in time, what basically happened was that people assumed the stand was called the Brewongle Stand
Yes.
because the grandstand is such a plain name, and it became sort of part of the vernacular. I'll meet you at the Brewongle.
Yes.
And so by 1951, when a gentleman named Keith Sharp became the cricket ground secretary, he actually announced that the stand is officially known as the Brewongle Stand. And because of that Indigenous link, and the link to the Indigenous is that it's actually named after the Indigenous people of the Hawkesbury region. That's where the name Brewongle comes from, the original name of the Brewongle village in western New South Wales.
Yes.
So there is an Indigenous link. But that was so locked in when they knocked the original Brewongle stand down in 1977 and replaced it with a new stand. There was no question the new stand was going to be called the Brewongle Stand. And of course, it's still there today. It'll probably get knocked down in the not too distant future, and I'm sure the new grandstand will be known as a Brewongle Stand as well.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. And in one hand, I'm all for like honoring those who have contributed significantly to the stadium or to the sporting field and honoring, Monty Noble and Victor Trumpo who have got stands through. But I also don't want them to take away all these quirky traditions which have existed for whatever reason. I mean, as you explained, it's such a almost ridiculous reason that is still called the Brewongle, but there would be an uproar if they changed it, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, and for me, look, writing about Alice and May Lee,
Mm.
the Mrs. Lee, as they were known in the press, I just really enjoyed doing that. But again, I've got to stress, Phil Derryman did the original research. Phil's done a lot of work on the Sydney Cricket Ground, and for someone like me, his shoulders were invaluable.
So, a constant theme on this podcast, Geoff, is the discussion of the great 1894-95 Ashes series. I think we've already mentioned it on this podcast. It went to 3-2, England finally clinching victory. But specifically the first test, the Sydney test, which took place in December 1894. You've already mentioned it's the test match that Sid Gregory scored his double century. I think it was the first test ever a team won, having been forced to follow on. There's so much to talk about and to unpack. But specifically for this podcast, I was hoping you could talk about Ned Gregory, who we've already spoken about, the groundsman, and the adoption of a particular soil for the pitch, which he used for this test match.
The story of soil at the SCG is a fascinating one. The ground originally is built on was essentially sand and swamp. It was actually a great achievement to build a cricket ground on that sort of material. The early pitches, the early square at the association ground was not very reliable, and matches were often played using 2 or even 4 pitches, with the batting side getting each batting side getting a fresh pitch to bat on. There was a very controversial incident in 1881 when Sheridan instructed Gregory to water the pitch, which was against the laws of the game,
Mm.
and Gregory refused, and Sheridan wanted to sack him. But the reality was that they had a lot of trouble with pitches, and it got worse as the 1880s went on. And after a series of low-scoring games, some of the scores you see in test matches played in Sydney in 1886, 87, 87, 88, the scores aren't great. They wrote to Melbourne and organised for sacks of Mary Creek soil, the soil that was used at the MCG, to be sent to Sydney. And that soil improved the Sydney square enormously.
Mm.
But Sheridan and Gregory still weren't happy, and they kept looking, and Gregory actually had lived for a while in the Illawarra. Dave Gregory was born at Wollongong, where his father was a school teacher in, I think, 1845. So Gregory and Sheridan went down to the south coast of New South Wales, first to Kiama, and then closer to Sydney of Bulli, and that's where they found the mother lode. And they found this Bulli soil. They brought it to Sydney to try it out, and they found it was just an extraordinary soil that dried remarkably quickly, and they could make the best cricket pitches in the world using it. And they were reluctant to not use Merri Creek because the improvement under Merri Creek had been fantastic. But for the first Ashes Test in 1894-95, it's interesting. Most of the press reports say that Ned Gregory used bull eye soil for that pitch. And it's a famous game, as you well know. We all well know that Australia scored a huge amount of runs, forced England to follow on, and then it stumps on day 5, I think, or day 6.
I think it
With a
was the
day to
fifth day's play. I think there was a rest,
Yes,
so it sort of yeah.
with a day to go. Australia were two for 70 odd at stumps, not needing many to win, but it rained overnight. They got caught on a wet pitch, lost their last 8 wickets for 36, and because the pitch was played on a bull-eye soil pitch, that then put a seed of doubt in Sheridan and Gregory's mind, to the point that for the 4th Test, they went back to Merri Creek soil, which is a crazy decision in one sense, because they played the intercolonial game that preceded the 4th Test on a bull-eye soil pitch, which then got them in a situation where they had 2 pitches side by side, a bull-eye soil pitch and a Merri Creek soil pitch, and they could compare the 2. And when it rained again and caused all sorts of carnage, England lost, I think, were bowled out twice in one day. The bull-eye soil pitch had dried out. The Merri Creek pitch was still a sticky. And as a consequence, Sheridan and Ned Gregory said, "We're never using Merri Creek again." And from that moment, Sydney became renowned for its bull-eye soil pitches.
Mm. I always feel sorry for the curators at the Sydney Cricket Ground because they also have to battle the elements in terms of rain. And sure enough, the great Test match of 1894 was rain affected and still is to this day, no matter whether the Test match is in December or January or February, March, whenever it is. I think there's some crazy statistic about more Test matches have been affected by rain or days lost at Sydney than any other Test venue in the
That
world.
could be true. I will say that I'm of the opinion, and I know a lot of people agree with me, that first Ashes Test in 1894-95 is the greatest
Mm,
cricket game played in Sydney.
yes,
For ebbs and flows, for the atmosphere on the Saturday when Sid Gregory and Blackham were batting.
yes.
I can just imagine the drama at the start when 3 wickets fall quickly and then Giffen made his 100. It's just a quite remarkable game.
And so many, I mean, it's a great team achievement, but many great individual performances. George Giffen, I
Yes.
think, hit 161, his
Mm.
highest Test score,
Yeah.
and then the English bowlers, in that final innings, Peel and was it Johnny Briggs?
Briggs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You mean we can dissect that as we have on the podcast.
In fact, it was interesting doing the research in that game because one of the stories is that Bobby Peel drank himself silly
Mm, yeah,
while the rain was falling and was hungover and play was delayed, so Peel could stumble onto the field. But there's no suggestion of that in any of play was not delayed. I can't imagine. Peel did not bowl like a man impaired. I think he bowled magnificently.
Peel's intoxication isn't mentioned in the SCG Trust minutes anywhere.
No, it's not. And in my book, I suggest strongly that he wasn't nearly as
Right.
hungover as some people might have suggested.
Legend, yes. Well, Australian cricket at this time was one of broken and disjointed organisations, especially between players and administrators. A lot of the confusion stemmed from the separate powers which existed under the mighty Melbourne Cricket Club and the rising influence of the trustees of the Sydney Cricket Ground. How did Sydney try to arrest some of that power away from the Melbourne Cricket Club, and how did this affect the touring English sides at the time?
Well, certainly the Melbourne club was well established when the trustees were appointed in the 1870s. And the first big battle between the two occurred in 1882-83 when the Melbourne Cricket Club managed Ivo Bligh's tour to Australia, and a return match in Sydney was cancelled at late notice, which cost the trustees money. And they were rather indignant at the manner in which they were treated by the Melbourne club. But things came to a real head in 1887-88 when the trustees backed a tour of English professionals to Australia, and the Melbourne Cricket Club brought out a team led by amateurs George Vernon and Lord Hawke, or the soon to be known as Lord Hawke. And this created this ridiculous situation where there were two English teams touring at the same time. It was interesting doing the research, going through the minutes, letters, newspaper reports. Over the years, the trustees have been largely blamed for the two tours occurring. I'm not sure that's fair. Ben Wardle, the all-powerful secretary of the Melbourne Cricket Club, was his tour wasn't locked into the last minute, and Sheridan was very keen for an English team to come out in that summer because it was the centenary of British settlement in Australia.
Mm.
And so he had been negotiating with Lillywhite, Shaw and Shrewsbury to bring out a professional side while they were in Australia the previous year. Most of the history's been very kind to Wardle in this case, but I maybe I'm biased, but I will argue that Sheridan certainly wasn't as much at fault as some historians have made out. But what was interesting, at the end of that summer, the two bodies, the Melbourne Cricket Club and the Sydney Trustees, were miles apart. But they very quickly came to realise that they were both at that time bluing with their own cricket associations. And I think while both bodies had visions of becoming the Lords of Australia, they both realised soon after 1887, 88 that that was never going to happen, and that actually they had more in common than they realised. And probably from as soon as 1888, 89, they started working quite well together, to the point that in the 1890s, they brought out, the two worked in partnership to bring out teams, the two Stoddart teams in 1894-95 and 1897-98. And I think they would have continued to work in partnership beyond that if there hadn't been that power struggle in Sydney in 1897-98 that led to the demise of the Ground Committee.